Fabia, do you share the same sentiment? Is it dangerous since you're on the ground right now? How difficult it is for you as a journalist to practice in Ivory Coast?
Well, I'm an African woman, so I blend in much more easily than David being a European man and a tall man who's easy to target. Anyway, from that point of view, I don't feel at risk. But as David has said, our colleagues who were staying at a hotel downtown that most of us have stayed in, that's where I stay. As David said, that's where he stayed. They had a very bad time. But many journalists will say to you, they were evacuated by French military forces. Many Ivorians just don't have that option. They have to stay barricaded, or they had to stay barricaded in their homes, trapped in their homes with heavy weapons fire ringing in their ears, unable to sleep, children petrified, terrorized, and of course still traumatized, because there'll be the post-traumatic syndrome that kicks in a little later. No, this is not an easy city to work in, but things are calmer now. But for weeks, it was difficult for anybody in Abidjan, whether you were a journalist or not a journalist, to live in this city because of the fierce fighting. And I have to add here that that is the immediate priority for incoming President Alassane Ouattara. He's got to pacify not only Abidjan, but the west of the country, where there has also been fierce fighting and mass killings with these disparate groups. We tend amongst the media to say pro-Ouattara forces or forces loyal to Alassane Ouattara, but that's not entirely the case. The forces are actually loyal to his prime minister, Guillaume Soro, who was before being Alassane Ouattara's prime minister, was Laurent Gbagbo's prime minister. He's a former rebel leader. Now, is he going to be able to control these forces who are now in Abidjan? You should see a lot of these young fellows armed to the teeth, driving around in cars that have been, and vehicles that have been commandeered, the sort of things that we saw during the civil war in Liberia and in Sierra Leone. It's not something that Abidjan is accustomed to. This is quite a sophisticated city. Ivorians in Abidjan have talked about La Sale Guerre, the dirty war, as they called the rebellion, but they hadn't tasted war. This is the first time that they've seen it close up. And I think it's made everybody stop and think, because now they know what the conclusions of war can be like and the effect it has not only on them professionally, but especially as families and to their children and so on. So that is going to be the huge priority for this new government, making sure there is peace, and after that, reconciliation.
Okay, now would be the question about economy. David, the political crisis has left Ivory Coast economy in shambles. Most notably, the cocoa exports were completely shut down. How difficult do you think it will be to restart the economic growth?
Still difficult. I mean, I visited twice recently. Last month, with this political deadlock ongoing, there was a kind of slow death happening, an economy grinding to a standstill, and really, all these pressures, working in tandem just to make things worse. So, schools would close down, and, it was estimated more than 1 million children were therefore out on the streets, some desperately trying to make money for their parents. Hospital supplies were running very low. Banks have been closed a long time. So it's very hard for people to get money and for anything to function. More recently, it still looks very dead. I mean, journalists who've been there longer than me said, with every passing day, things gradually come more and more back to life. And indeed, I did notice a few days after the fall of Gbagbo that, that some street markets were open again, and there was kind of very long queues at a boulangerie that had reopened, and just a few sort of grounds for cautious optimism. But I understand that President Ouattara's call for civil servants to return to work on Monday, not many of them did. And basically things are moving very slowly, and clearly, until security is in place, that will remain a big problem. I think the African Union has today removed sanctions from the new regime. So, there are clues and signs and indicators that it could be moving in the right direction. And even in Abidjan, if the violence remains relatively isolated in pockets, then the rest of the city may be able to come back to life. But let's not forget, meanwhile, in the West, far from serious economic recovery, there is still a dire humanitarian emergency and an outbreak of polio, and there it's far from normal economic activity. It's actually one of these major crises with UNICEF and Save the Children and numerous aid agencies sort of dashing in just to keep things going at all.
Yeah, speaking of lifting sanctions and talking about legal terms, there's been much talk about the need for people on both sides to be held for account for war crimes committed during the crisis. And the prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, Luis Moreno Ocampo, has said that he opened an investigation into atrocities, and Ouattara has said that anyone who committed crimes will be prosecuted. What do you think would be the best way to handle this politically sensitive issue? Mohammed, I'm going to direct this to you.
Oh, well, this is a much broader question than my expertise. I would actually defer the question to someone else.
Okay, so Afibia, in your research report, you've also mentioned that many humanitarian organizations also accuse the pro-Ouattara forces of targeting civilians and committing human rights abuses, especially in western parts of Ivory Coast. How important is it that the new government distance itself from the forces Nouvelle and other rebel groups suspected of crimes?
Yeah, they're no longer called the new forces. They're now called the Republican forces, and they are
the Republican forces,
the government army. But as we have heard, incoming President Alassane Ouattara said to us just last week that he expects that the pro-Gbagbo camp, some of them, are going to have to face some sort of prosecution at a local and an international level. But of course, the forces that propelled him to power are also accused of atrocities against civilians. Here in Abidjan, in the west, which is still turbulent, and so who is going to prosecute them? Will it be the UN Human Rights Commission taking what evidence, or it's the results of its investigation to the International Criminal Court? We're waiting to see, but it's not going to be just one side. Both sides. Most people agree that, yes, the pro-Gbagbo forces were responsible for far more damage, attacks, and targeting of civilians, but that both sides, those who propelled Ouattara to power and those who tried to keep him from power, are responsible for human rights abuses. So we're going to see. There have already been investigations. They are continuing, and we'll have to see how soon this happens. When people are talking about reconciliation, Alassane Ouattara talking about setting up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission a la South Africa, does that mean that it's going to be with or without impunity? Many Ivorians feel that those who are responsible must be held to account. You have the White House, you have the African Union, you have the Economic Commission of West African States, ECOWAS, the regional bloc, and others saying that there must be no impunity in this case. We'll have to see.
Okay, David, I'll also direct the same question to you. What do you think would be the best way to handle this politically sensitive issue? Would it be the right way to go the way Sierra Leone handled their case by creating special courts, or would it be best to go about it in the Rwanda's case, or should we wait for the International Criminal Court to resolve their crisis?
I think best to give the new government the first chance to do it, and if it can be resolved domestically, that would be ideal. And I believe that's the position of groups like Human Rights Watch, with the proviso that if it is not dealt with and if it's inadequate, then one reverts to international mechanisms of justice, such as the International Criminal Court. Something along the lines of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa might be a model. And it's concerning. On the one hand, Ouattara has made some positive noises about that and probably said the right things, that crimes will be investigated. However, there's a gap between that rhetoric and what many of his lieutenants are saying. And I was at the Golf Hotel myself a few days ago and interviewed one of his spokespeople who seemed in complete denial that anyone who might be regarded as a pro-Ouattara fighter had committed any atrocities, and even suggested that Ouattara is only saying that because he's so confident that all his loyalists will be exonerated, and that is quite alarming if it is not going to be even-handed. Another potentially thorny question for him is that, of course, in the couple of weeks of the main conflict, thousands and thousands of pro-Gbagbo fighters actually switched to Ouattara's side. I think it's a fair bet that at least some of those had committed atrocities at some point, and yet by the end they were actually fighting for Ouattara. And again, will they be brought to justice? Will they sort of be let off the hook because they defected when they did? It does need a very strong, independent body, within the country, a very strong institution, and I'm not sure the infrastructure is there for such a thing, but a body that can begin at the top and ask and investigate the question. Mr. Ouattara, do you yourself have responsibility for the actions that were carried out in your name, and sort of work the way through everyone who is accused?
All right, so I'll direct this last question to Mohammed. What will the future hold for Ivory Coast in general, in terms of the media status in Ivory Coast? What do you think would be the future?
Well, we certainly hope that the Ouattara will continue the tradition of a free press in Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast has always had one of the freest, most vibrant press in Africa, and he has championed press freedom. His media outlets supporting him were essentially his voice throughout the struggle, and they were the victim of much harassment, censorship, and attack by pro-Gbagbo and pro-Gbagbo elements and members of the administration. So we hope that as he comes to power, that he will keep his word, essentially, in terms of respecting freedom of the press. And with this ongoing situation, journalists are particularly at risk because of their public profile, because they live in neighborhoods where they're known, and they become the target because of their affiliation with such and such media. So I think we're rather optimistic, but in the short term, though, we have serious concerns about security because of the mix of elements that make up the Ouattara government.
All right, so we're running out of time, and I would like to thank our guests for today, Amphibia Quest Arcton, Mohammed Hassim Ketia, and David Smith. Our director is Travis McMillan, audio by Pat Akers. Rebecca Wolfson is our executive producer, and our video producer is Tim Wall. Semini Tabor is our production assistant. Our other producers of Global Journalists are Courtney Flatt, David Cotton, and Ryan Kress, and Jessica Popovac. This is Salam Solomon for Global Journalists, reminding you that you can download, view, or listen to the show, plus additional features by going to globaljournalist.org.